Bava Batra Daf Yomi Bava Batra with Aleph and Amud Bet. Public information, miltã dmit-amra באפי תלתא. And once again, I hope that our learning together and the learning we do every morning should be a schus for the days and weeks ahead. Should have nisim that will bring us a time of shalom, a time of peace until Mashiach comes. And next week, depending on what happens, I have to be overseas. I don't know if I'll be able to get away or not, but whatever the case is, Rav Ghibli will give the shiurim, so those who are listening online, there probably won't be shiurim uploaded next week. We get into some Lashon Harah. This is, I think, the third or the fourth in a series about the spread of information, the spread of word, and how that happens. And here we come into the area of Lashon Harah, where the halachot of spreading words that are derogatory and therefore could cause other people damage. Our Gemara says, Ashkechinu Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina l'Talmid of the Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina found the Talmudim, the students of Rabbi Yochanan, Omalu, and he said to them, Rabbi Yochanan was in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yossi but Rabbi Chanina was in Bovel, so there was a bit of traveling backwards and forwards, so he was very excited to meet students from the yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, where Rabbi Yochanan is the Rosh Yeshiva, and Omalu, mi Omar Rabbi Yochanan mecha'a bekama. Did Rabbi Yochanan ever teach you when a person objects, when a person challenges an occupation of his property, how many people does he have to tell this to in order for it to be a valid mecha? If he goes and tells it to the occupier himself, who yesterday was Steve, so we'll stay with Steve, and he tells Steve that you're in my property, that's how it is. But what happens if he's somewhere else and he gets a few people together and he says, I'm registering a complaint and a challenge that Steve is illegitimately occupying my property? How many people does he have to tell that to? Rabbi Chia bar Abba Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, Rabbi Yochanan said, Mecha'a bifnei shnayim. Yes, our Rebbe taught us, Rabbi Yochanan taught you need to have two people, like you need two witnesses, you need two people. Rabbi Avo, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Avo says, no, I don't remember him saying it that way. What I remember Rabbi Yochanan saying is you need three people. So clearly what they're arguing about is understanding Rabbi Yochanan in the context of this, the din of Rabba bar Rav Huna. What's the din of Rabba bar Rav Huna? Dama Rabba bar Rav Huna, kol miltã dmit-amra באפי תלתא, anything which is said in front of three people, let ba mishum lishna bisha, there can no longer be a problem of Lashon Harah. Man da'amar bifnei shnayim, let Rabba bar Rav Huna. The one who says that you've got to say it in front of two, he doesn't hold of this din that Rabbi bar Rav Huna said, that anything which is said in front of three people, there isn't Lashon Harah. Even two people, it gets around. And the other one holds, no, unless you've said something to three people, you can't assume that the news will travel. Then the Gemara says, everybody agrees with the law of Rabbi bar Rav Huna that when you say something in front of three people, the news will travel. Here, the question is whether you need mecha'a shelo b'fanav or not, whether mecha'a shelo b'fanav works or not. If you say it in front of two people, then according to Rabbi bar Rav Huna, the news may never get to Steve. And is that valid? We've been learning over the last couple of days, what's the din with mecha'a shelo b'fanav? What about objecting in a way that doesn't get to Steve? Can we assume ultimately it will or not? And that's what the machlokes is. Rabbeinu Gershom translates this Gemara importantly. Bekama b'nei Adam, did Rabbi Yochanan teach you how many people do you have to say this in front of? Then he says, Kol miltã shel genai dmit-amra באפי תלתא v'azli hanitzlato u'mishtay la'achrini let ba mishum lishna bisha. Any word this genai is very important in the Rabbeinu Gershom. Any word of genai, so genai means derogatory. If you say something derogatory about another person in front of three, and one of those three spreads the word, that's not called Lashon Harah. And the reason is because it's going to get out in any case. It's public information. And Lashon Harah is when you are the vehicle by which the gossip is transmitted. But when it's already public information, that's not considered Lashon Harah. And therefore, v'hanamidova genaihu, this is a davar genai, dekamalu ploni gazlanahu. If I'm saying, I want you to know that Steve is occupying my territory, my property without my permission, what am I implying? That Steve's a ganav, that Steve is stealing my property. That's Lashon Harah. So if it's in front of three, it's not Lashon Harah. If it's in front of two, it would still be Lashon Harah because other people won't know about it. And then there could be Lashon Harah, and Rabbi Gershom explains further on. And what are we worried about? That if I say in front of two people, Steve is occupying my property, I say this in front of Howard and David. Now, Howard and David aren't going to talk about it because they're tzaddikim, and they're saying, if we're going to repeat this, that could be Lashon Harah. What are we implying? That Steve's a ganav? So they won't repeat it. And therefore it's never going to get to Steve. But if I've said it in front of three people, then there's already an assumption people know the halacha that it's not Lashon Harah anymore because it's public information. And now I've told it to Howard and to Steve and to Joey, and so it's no longer Lashon Harah, so somebody's going to pass the information on. Steve will eventually get the information. That's how Rabbi Gershom learns it. Asks the Rashbam a very powerful question. And he says, V'chol raboteinu mefashim. The Rashbam learns it differently. The Rashbam learns it simply as we learnt it, that if you've said it in front of two people, you learn from the laws of Lashon Harah that if you say something in front of two people, it's not yet public information. If you say it in front of three people, it is public information. Therefore, now we leave the laws of Lashon Harah, we come to the laws of Chazakah, and we say, and therefore, if you want to make a mecha'ah, if you want to make a challenge of Steve's illegitimate occupation of your property, you need to say it in front of three people, because two people you can't assume are going to spread the information, as we see in the laws of Lashon Harah. So according to the Rashbam, we're simply learning from the laws of Lashon Harah how many people you've got to tell in order for the information to get to Steve ultimately. According to the Rabbeinu Gershom, the problem is Lashon Harah in this particular case, that if you've told it to only two people, then repeating it to a third person would be Lashon Harah. And therefore, the two aren't going to do it. They're Yoreh Shemayim. They're not going to do such a thing. That's what we're worried about. Ask the Rashbam, V'chol raboteinu mefashim degabi mecha nami Lashon Harah ika. All our Rabbeim have explained that when you object to Steve's illegitimate occupation of your territory, that in itself is Lashon Harah. And therefore, you've got to say it in front of three, not in front of two. And those Raboteinu is Rabbeinu Gershom, and it's the Rimi Gash, and it's the Yad Ramah, and various others. And he says, "V'lav miltahi." That's nonsense. He's very sharp, the Rashbam. Look how he's willing to challenge even the greats. And he says that can't be. This can't be compared to Lashon Harah. All you can learn from Lashon Harah is how many people constitutes public information. But this itself has nothing to do with Lashon Harah. Why? What's the whole principle of mecha'ah, of challenging occupation? We want it to get to Steve. We want you to talk about it. The whole idea is so that it will get to him. And it's a mitzvah to tell Steve, you better hold on to your documents, Steve, because the owner of the property is challenging your occupation. So this has got nothing to do with Lashon Harah, says the Rashbam. Very powerful question. But if you notice the words of the Rabbeinu Gershom, and I've highlighted because those words are different from the way the Rimi Gash and the Ramah says it. When the Rimi Gash and the Ramah say virtually the same as Rabbeinu Gershom, they use the word Lishna Bisho, which means Lashon Harah. When Rabbeinu Gershom uses the word, when he explains it, he uses the word Gnai. What's the difference between using the word Lashon Harah and Gnai? When you use the word Lashon Harah, you're implying a technical term. Lishna Bisha, Lashon Harah. What is the laws of Lashon Harah? Look up in the Chofetz Chaim and the Lashon Harah, and you'll know what is Lashon Harah and what isn't Lashon Harah. And if you say it in front of three people, then it's not Lashon Harah to repeat it. If you say it in front of two people, it is Lashon Harah. Those are the laws of Lashon Harah. Ask the Rashbam, but this is not Lashon Harah. This is a legal information that Steve needs to hear. This is a chesed. This is not Lashon Harah. And even the word Lashon Harah, the Rashbam would be valid in his question. Lashon Harah means it's bad talk. You're talking negatively, you're talking destructively. But if I tell people, please make sure that Steve gets to hear that the owner is challenging his occupation, what's bisha about that? What's ra about that? But the Rabbeinu Gershom doesn't use the word lishna bisha. What does Rabbeinu Gershom use the word? Gnai, derogatory. Derogatory is much more subtle. Anything which could be interpreted derogatorily could be Lashon Harah, says Rabbeinu Gershom. And therefore here, yes, you're right. that technically this isn't Lashon Harah because it's important for Steve to hear it, but it could be Lashon Harah. How could it be Lashon Harah? If you skip to the end of the sources, there's an important piece of Chofetz Chaim. I don't know that we'll manage to get there in the time that we have. If you look at the Rambam paskins, Ve'im ne'emru dvarim elu bifnei shlosha kvar nishma hadavar v'noda. If something is said in front of three people, then it's well known, it's heard and known, it's public information. The moment you've told three people, that's called public information. Therefore, ve'im siper hadavar echad min hashlosha pa'am acheret ein bo mishum lashon hara. And therefore, if one of the three now repeats it to somebody else, that's not called Lashon Harah because he's repeating something which is already widely known. But look what the Rambam adds. And it's possible that he adds it because of the Rabbeinu Gershom. V'hu shelo yitkavein la'avir hakol u'legaloto yoter. There is a condition. The condition is your kavanah. If your intention is to gossip, it is Lashon Harah. I can't just say it's a mitzvah. Steve, I'm giving Mekayim a mitzvah to make sure that you have your shtoros. I don't want you to get into any trouble. I want to make sure that you're keeping your documents. I'm a big tzaddik. I'm communicating what you need to hear. Says the Rambam, not so simple. Even if it was said in front of three people, it's not so simple. What is the inner place from which I come? Am I coming from a place of gossip and troublemaking? Or am I coming from a place of help and chesed? And that inner place makes the difference between a mitzvah and an avera. If I come from a mitzvah of l'shem shamayim, if I come from an inner place of l'shem shamayim, that's a mitzvah. If I come from an inner place of being derogatory, implying, you know what he says about you? He says you're a ganav. If there's even a little bit of that in my inner place, then it's lashon shel ganai. And that becomes Lashon Harah, and it becomes a prohibition of the Torah to be able to say so. So now you have a situation where Howard and David have heard, so they're not going to take it any further. Ask the Rashbam, why not? This is a mitzvah. We want Steve to hear about it. But Howard and David are tzaddikim, and they say, you know what, we're not sufficiently confident that there would be no pleasure in telling Howard that he's been accused of being a gazlan by this other person who none of us like in any case. No, we're just not sure that we do. And if we do have even the slightest intention of taking pleasure in that, that would be an Issur D'Oraisa. So better we don't talk. So they're going to keep quiet. That's what the Rabbeinu Gershon comes to teach us, differently from the Rimi Gashan, differently from the Yad Ramah. And according to the words of Rabbeinu Gershon, the kasha, the question of the Rashbam, doesn't apply. It only applies to the other Rishonim, but not to Rabbeinu Gershon. And Rabbeinu Gershom explains what this whole derech is, what the shitta is, but the wording hasn't been taken up accurately by others. In addition to the Rambam at the bottom of the source sheet, the Hagos Maimonis adds on there are further conditions. For example, if he told the three people, don't pass on the information, we learnt already that then you've got to abide by that. If he said this is confidential, I don't want you to tell anybody, then you've got to abide by that. So that would be a situation where you can't pass it on. And even in a case, the Hagos Maimonides brings minayin omer lechavero davar shu baral yomar ad shi yomar lecha emor. That even if somebody doesn't say this is confidential, but he doesn't say to you, you're free to pass this information on, and you don't check with him. Person just tells you something which could be confidential, you have to assume it is confidential. Unless he tells you you can pass it on, that it's not confidential. So there are many conditions when you hear something, even if you hear it in front of three, and how much more so in front of two, that you have to be very careful about whether you can pass this information. It's not just a blanket rule that if it's been told to three people, it's now public information, and you can tell it to whoever you want to. And so this Machlokes Rabbeinu Gershom and the Rashbam in how to understand our Gemara becomes very relevant in understanding how subtle the laws of Lashon Harah are. It's not just about technical laws. Is this Lashon Harah? Isn't this? Can you say it? It's been said in front of three. Can you repeat it? Can't you repeat it? Yes, there's that side of it. But like all halacha, especially ben adam lechavero, especially when you're getting into personal halacha, the inner place from which you come can make an enormous difference as to whether something is a mitzvah d'oraisa, a mitzvah of the Torah, or an issur d'oraisa, or a prohibition of a Torah. Exactly the same action, exactly the same circumstance. The only thing that's different is that inner place from which you come. Is there some kind of intention? Is there a kavanah, as the Rambam says, laha'avir hakol ulegaloto yoter? Are you trying to publicize something which shouldn't be publicized? Or are you really a tzaddik who's only doing it because you have the interests of Steve at heart and you don't want him to lose his document and thereby to lose his property? What's really going on inside you? And that's why the whole area of halakha and musar are so closely interlinked. Musar means personal development, developing your interiority, developing who you are on the inside. And nowadays, a lot of the religious focus is on the outside, on the technicalities of halakha, which are critically important. Of course, we need to know exactly what the technicalities of the halakha are, but that's not sufficient. At the end of the day, what can make a difference between a mitzvah and an avera, between something that's virtuous and something that's a vice, is the inner place from which you come, the kavanah, the intention you have when you actually commit the action.